On January 14th, 2021, in a probate conference room 2 blocks off the Callaway County Courthouse Square, Dale Coleman set a metal thermos on the floor by her boot and took the only open chair at the end of the table, while 3 cousins in clean quarter-zips and bright new work jackets looked at her patched barn coat and whispered that she looked like she needed gas money more than inherited acreage. She had driven in before daylight in a 1998 Chevrolet Silverado, with rust climbing both rear fenders, a cracked dashboard, and 312,000 miles on the odometer. The driver's seat had a tear wide enough to show foam. Her overalls were faded at the knees and mended twice at the left pocket. One cousin stared at her gloves, thumb stitched in dark thread, then slid his eyes toward the attorney, as if the county had made a clerical error. The attorney did not make errors. He read assets, then liabilities, and the room changed shape through numbers. Dale was assigned 640 acres of winter wheat ground that had once averaged 71 bushels per acre under her late uncle, and had slipped to 49 over 5 years of deferred maintenance, thin fertility, and borrowed operating cash. Then he placed a metal file box in front of her and read the obligations line by line. $482,317 total liabilities, including an operating note at 9.4%, machinery loans at 7.8%, unpaid fertilizer invoices totaling $63,900, and delinquent property taxes of $18,240. The cousins stopped whispering. One of them asked whether she planned to sell immediately. Dale looked down at the file tabs and said, "Not today." 2 words. Flat voice. No performance. The judgment in that room had history behind it. For 15 years, Dale had been the quiet farm bookkeeper people forgot was present, the woman pouring coffee near the church basement ledger table while louder men debated acres and markets. She was the person who noticed that a quoted 7-year equipment note at 6.9% would cost $41,772 in interest on a $96,000 principal, and that a 2-point rate increase at reset could add another $11,000 if yields missed 1 season. She was also the person nobody asked for speech, because she dressed like a hired hand and drove a truck older than some interns at the cooperative elevator. Yet she could recite amortization schedules from memory and spot balance sheet stress from 2 years of grain receipts and 1 page of input invoices. Her rule had started at 19 in August 2003, standing at the fence line of a neighbor's foreclosure auction outside Ovas. The neighbor, Glenn Rourke, had borrowed heavily in the expansion years, then got caught when rates moved and crop prices did not. Dale watched lot tags go up on implements Glenn had rebuilt himself, watched strangers bid on his grain drill in 3-minute increments, and watched his wife fold sale sheets with both hands so they would not shake. No one was cruel that day. That made it worse. Good people. Bad structure. Glenn lost 560 acres and left with a check that did not cover what remained on 2 notes after penalties. Dale drove home and wrote 1 sentence in a spiral notebook. Debt will not control the steering wheel again. She built that sentence into arithmetic. From 2004 through 2020, she tracked every outside hour she worked. First at $12.50 per hour, cleaning veterinary stalls on weekends, then at $18 handling books for 2 seed dealers, then at $24 an hour doing seasonal compliance work for a grain merchandiser. She did not chase appearance. She chased margin. She kept a private ledger in the same file box style as the one she received in probate, except hers was organized by month, not by lender. By December 2020, her personal cash reserves were $186,400, split between a money market account at 1.9% and a short-term certificate ladder averaging 2.3% annual yield. She had zero consumer debt, no auto payment, no revolving card balance, and annual living expenses under $29,500, including fuel, utilities, health insurance, and repairs. Her progression was not dramatic. It was repetitive. 2006, saved $8,700, bought a used 16-foot grain drill for $1,400 cash, rented it out during fall seeding, netted $2,360 after fuel and bearings. 2009, purchased 40 acres of marginal pasture for $62,000, cash at estate sale, leased it for hay at $92 per acre, grossed $3,680 yearly. 2012, sold hay rights and reinvested $11,400 into tile repairs on a neighbor contract, paid back in 3 harvests with 4% premium, total return $13,920. 2015, bought a salvage gravity wagon for $900, repaired for $380, sold for $2,300. 2018, passed on a financed combine package, despite tax incentives, kept custom harvest contract instead, preserved $74,000 liquidity. Year by year, boring decisions accumulated into optionality. Optionality became power. The county would later repeat that sequence as if it had been obvious from the beginning. Quiet numbers, then leverage, then the day a bank signed as her borrower. The first test came quickly. On February 12, 2021, First Prairie Bank Vice President Nolan Price sat across from Dale in a pressed white shirt with a navy tie clip, dealership coffee mug, and a polished pickup waiting outside with temporary plates still taped to the rear glass. He slid a refinance package across the desk. Roll all obligations into a new $525,000 note at 10.1% with annual rate resets and a cross-collateral clause attaching her home acreage. 10 business days to sign. He framed it as modern agriculture, necessary scale, standard flexibility. Dale read page 4 twice, tapped the clause with one finger, and said, "No variable debt, no blank risk." Nolan told her she was being unrealistic and warned she would not make planning without his structure. She left his office and executed a different plan in 14 days. She sold 2 underused grain carts for $27,400. She liquidated a non-essential 80-acre hunting lease option for $96,000. She negotiated prepay fertilizer terms and diesel timing discounts worth $14,880. She paid seed, fuel, and early nutrient invoices in cash, cutting immediate borrowing needs by 43%. The file box liabilities were still large, but the cash flow pressure changed direction. She was no longer reacting to lender timelines. She was setting her own. Then spring exposed who had buffer and who had leverage. Wheat futures fell from $6.78 to $5.21 per bushel, while input costs rose 19%. Nolan reappeared twice in field drives, each time with a polished sales argument and brochures for financed upgrades. Dale answered with parts receipts. She rebuilt a 1974 John Deere 443 for $3,860 in components and shop labor instead of financing a $198,000 replacement at 8.2%. On a 7-year note that avoided roughly $64,000 in interest and payment pressure, near $3,100 per month. She shifted to variable rate nitrogen application, dropping use from 118 pounds per acre to 91 without compromising stand health, and negotiated cooperative drying terms that reduced handling by 23 cents per bushel across 31,400 bushels. That single adjustment preserved $7,222 in margin. No heroics, just controlled leaks. By harvest close in 2021, her operating cost per acre had moved decisively, and so had the way local people described her. Not flashy, not lucky, precise. She still drove the same Silverado with the same rust line over the wheel wells. She still packed lunch in wax paper and wrote receipts into a ledger before dusk. But the farm was no longer drifting. It was under command, one fixed-risk decision at a time. 3 mornings later, Dale parked that same Silverado outside Mid-Missouri Ag Supply to pick up hydraulic hose, bearing kits, and 2 pallet forks she had bought from a liquidation list, and the lot looked like a dealership catalog around her. Polished dually pickups, chrome wheels, fresh wax, and 1 black 3/4-ton truck with a vanity plate that read, "Grow Fast." She stepped out in faded overalls, patched at the thigh, with a grease mark across her sleeve that had survived 2 wash cycles. Her cap brim had gone soft at the edges. She carried a folded part sheet and a cashier check for $9,640. At the counter, a salesman in a pressed logo shirt glanced once at her boots, then toward a younger couple in clean chore jackets, and asked, without looking back, "Do you need the budget catalog or the financing desk?" Dale set the check on the counter and said, "I need Lot 17 and Lot 22 released today." He picked up the check and stopped talking. Lot 17 was a used bin fan assembly with control box. Lot 22 was a working grain leg motor with spare belts, both from a retired operation 20 miles west. She had bought them at sealed bid, $6,200 for the fan package, $2,900 for the motor set, $540 for freight and loading. The same capacity new would have run $21,400 before tax and installation, or roughly $29,000 financed over 5 years at 7.6%, with nearly $5,900 in interest. She signed the receipt, took her copy, and asked for the auger flighting quote in writing. The salesman handed it over with both hands and called her Mom on the way out. Respect arrived through arithmetic again. By the 3rd week of October 2021, she had built a routine that looked small from the road and large in a ledger. Mornings were for field passes and machine checks. Midday was for supplier calls and grain tickets. Evenings were for cost coding every invoice into 6 columns: input, repair, labor, fuel, tax, interest. She tracked cost per acre, cost per bushel, and cash cushion in days. She wanted 90 days of operating cash visible at all times. If that cushion dropped below 60, discretionary spending stopped. No exceptions. The cousins who had whispered at probate still measured wealth by what sat in a driveway. Dale measured it by how many bad months she could absorb without asking permission. Before we go any further, if you want to know how a woman in patched gloves reached lender status over a bank, vice president, subscribe now and stay through the numbers, because the turning point in this story is hidden inside years that looked uneventful. Her private discipline did not begin with inheritance documents or lender meetings. It began with humiliation that did not belong to her and never left her memory. In September 2003, 1 month after that foreclosure auction outside Ovas, she wrote down every fixed payment she could find in her own life and marked each as required or optional. Required was rent, utilities, fuel to work, and health insurance premium. Optional was everything else. She cut optional spending from $312 per month to $74 in one cycle, then moved the difference to savings before she paid for anything discretionary. She treated savings as a bill owed to future stability. She also built skill inventory the way other people built social calendars. Monday nights, she learned QuickBooks reconciliation for a seed dealer who paid her $85 per closeout set. Tuesdays in harvest season, she weighed trucks at a cooperative scale house for $16 an hour plus overtime. Winter Saturdays, she cleaned and repainted used feed bunks with her uncle and sold them for a margin that ranged from $70 to $210 each. In 2004, her gross outside income was $28,940. She saved $11,280. In 2005, her gross was $32,110. She saved $13,900. In 2006, after a transmission failure on the Silverado that cost $2,180, she still saved $8,700 and refused an auto note that would have cost $418 per month for 6 years. There was a mentor in those years, though he would never have called himself that. Earl Kessler farmed 310 acres near Millersburg, ran old equipment, and kept envelopes in a kitchen drawer labeled diesel, repairs, taxes, seed. Earl had one rule for younger people who asked him for help: cash first, pride second. If they did not have full cash, they brought half and worked for the rest. In 2007, he sold Dale a Warren International Harvester 1086 with 9,400 hours for $8,000, payable $4,000 now and $4,000 after wheat. No interest, no paperwork beyond a signed bill of sale and an index card in his drawer. The tractor needed injector work, a hydraulic seal kit, and 2 front tires. Dale put $2,640 in parts and machine shop labor into it over 9 months and had a reliable field unit for $10,640 total. A comparable finance tractor at that time would have required about $26,000 purchase, plus interest. Earl told her, "Debt is a hired man who does not leave at dark." She wrote it in her notebook beside the 2003 line. When Earl passed away in 2016, Dale attended the visitation in her work clothes because she came straight from replacing a feeder chain. She handed his daughter, Janie Kessler, a sealed envelope containing $14,000. That was the original $8,000 tractor price, plus the $4,000 deferred portion he had already received, plus an additional $2,000 marked thank you. Janie tried to hand it back. Dale said, "He gave me room. Keep it." Janie used the money to settle final medical invoices and keep her father's farmhouse through probate. That thread closed with dignity, the way Earl would have wanted. Her no-debt framework hardened during 2008 through 2012, when rates and commodity swings punished farms that had thin margins and large notes. She tracked neighbors quietly, never as gossip, always as data and caution. Glenn Rourke had already fallen. In 2009, Patrick Hale financed a new combine package at 6.4% on a 7-year term, then added 2 grain carts the next season. By 2012, his annual machinery payments reached $97,200, while his net crop margin after inputs averaged $84,000 in 2 weak years. He sold 180 acres to cover arrears and leased back 60. In 2011, Denise and Carl Brenner expanded rented ground from 520 to 1,040 acres under aggressive cash rent assumptions at $248 per acre, funded by an operating line that reset upward. Two below-trend yields and fertilizer spikes left them negative $143,000 over 26 months. They exited row crop operations and moved to custom hay work. None of them were reckless people. They were decent operators in a structure that offered no room for error. Dale built room for error on purpose. She kept annual living expenses low and explicit. In 2014, housing $0 because the farmhouse title was clear through family transfer, utilities $3,460, food $4,980, fuel $2,740, insurance $5,880, clothing and boots $420, church and local giving $1,200, repairs and miscellaneous $3,110, total $21,790. In 2018, even with medical deductible costs and higher diesel, she remained at $27,940. In 2020, she reached $29,480 and still saved over $18,000. She was not performing poverty. She was purchasing freedom from forced decisions. If you are seeing value in this kind of breakdown, press like and share it with one person who believes high income automatically means high wealth, because this is where most people confuse motion with progress. Her early discipline on inherited ground followed the same principles, but under brighter pressure. She started by decomposing the 640 acres into management zones instead of treating it as one struggling block. Zone A, 220 acres with better drainage and historically stronger protein response. Zone B, 275 acres mixed performance with compaction issues. Zone C, 145 acres, chronic weak spots needing drainage and nutrient correction. She sampled each zone separately, negotiated variable rate application maps, and refused blanket input programs sold on convenience. The first major auction after probate came in December 2021 at a farm dispersal near Kingdom City. Buyers expected her to watch. She arrived before sunrise, stood by the implement line with a legal pad, and bid only 3 times. She bought a 1980s field cultivator for $4,600, a grain drill for $1,350, and a parts lot, including belts, chains, and 2 monitor units for $780. Total outlay $6,730. Equivalent dealer pricing for similar working capacity, even used, would have approached $24,000. She spent $1,940 in winter repairs and repainting, then put both units into spring service. The machinery loans in her inherited stack dropped because she sold 2 redundant financed implements for $31,200 and applied every dollar to principal at 7.8%. Interest avoided over the remaining term, approximately $4,860. Her maintenance discipline was plain and relentless. Each machine had a binder page with date, hours, parts, and labor. Grease intervals were taped inside shop doors. Filters were bought in volume when seasonal discounts hit 5% or better. She used off-brand where reliability data supported it and paid premium where failure risk would cost field time. It was not romantic. It was operational risk control. The house looked exactly as it had before probate. Old cabinets, repaired linoleum, 1 kitchen light with a pull chain that clicked twice before it held. Her table was scarred oak. That is where major decisions were made, with coffee rings beside fertilizer quotes and county tax notices. She ate leftovers, packed lunches, and tracked waste by category. In 2022, she reduced household food waste from an estimated $780 to $290 by meal planning around field weeks. Small numbers repeated. That pattern financed larger choices. At the same time, she did not mistake thrift for isolation. When Maria and Thomas Weller announced their auction date, Dale called 2 days ahead and asked for serial numbers on a header trailer and a serviceable grain auger. She paid fair cash on sale day, no opportunistic squeeze, then gave Thomas a written option to rent the auger back at zero fee for that season while they transitioned out of owned row crop equipment. When Caleb Dunn lost his 420 acres under reset pressure, she bought one of his tillage tools at market value and allowed his nephew to store it in her shed through winter. Practical help, no speeches. By March 2022, one line in her ledger explained the entire philosophy. Control timing, control terms, control survival. She had reduced dependency on revolving operating debt, lowered break-even per acre, and preserved enough cash to choose when to market grain rather than dumping into harvest congestion. The outside image had not moved 1 inch. Same rusted Silverado, same patched coat, same careful silence in rooms full of louder confidence. Underneath that image sat something most people never bothered to calculate. A farmer with expanding optionality, shrinking fixed risk, and the patience to let numbers do the arguing. She tested that optionality the next morning at the scarred oak table, spreading 3 legal pads beside the file box and building a full 3-year operating model down to monthly cash peaks and troughs. 1 pad tracked agronomy decisions by field zone, 1 tracked debt service by note and maturity date, and 1 tracked timing risk, which she defined as the number of days she could hold grain before she had to sell for liquidity. The underlying principle was simple, but non-trivial in execution. If she could control timing, she could capture basis, avoid panic sales, and turn volatility into margin instead of damage. By the second week of April 2022, she had committed to a capital decision most operators around her considered backward. She bought used on-farm storage components in pieces rather than financing a turnkey package. Fan and control system from Lot 17 and Lot 22, auger flighting from a partial closeout, salvage sweep components from an estate line item nobody else wanted, and 2 labor crews paid cash by the hour over weekends. Total installed cost came to $84,500, including electrical, concrete patchwork, and safety retrofits. The equivalent new package quoted through 2 vendors ranged from $214,000 to $228,000 before finance charges. At 8.0% over 7 years, that finance route would have carried total payments near $288,000. Her route preserved roughly $130,000 in future cash outflow and kept another lender out of her decision chain. The year-by-year sequence sharpened right there. In 2021, her total gross receipts reached $428,960, composed of crop sales, custom work, crop insurance proceeds tied to prior yield loss bands, and the asset liquidations she had already executed. Cash operating expense was $266,040. Depreciation on remaining equipment was $35,120. Interest expense across inherited notes and short carry was $35,500. Net farm income closed at $92,300. She did not spend the win. She applied $146,317 to principal reduction, moving total debt from $482,317 to $336,000 by year-end through a combination of current earnings and a planned draw from her own reserve structure. In 2022, she repeated the pattern with tighter cost control and better grain timing. Variable rate nutrient placement lowered per acre input drag without yield sacrifice in stronger zones. Cooperative drying terms remained in place. Repair-first machinery discipline held. Total gross receipts rose to $515,420, aided by post-harvest storage timing and stronger execution on basis. Cash operating expense came to $286,900 despite inflation pressure because she cut waste line by line. Fewer emergency parts runs, lower idle diesel, and negotiated chemical terms tied to pickup windows. Depreciation and interest together were $43,820. Net farm income closed at $184,700. Then she pushed hard on principal again, reducing debt from $336,000 to $118,000 before the 2022 books closed. The basis capture became the hinge. She held 42,600 bushels into winter windows where local basis improved an average of 74 cents per bushel over harvest offers. That adjustment alone added $31,524 in gross margin without a single additional acre planted. It was the kind of number most people ignored because it looked small next to land headlines. Yet those numbers were exactly how she widened the gap between appearance and reality. She did not need to look successful. She needed her cost of survival to keep falling. At the same time, she tightened household spending again, not because she had to, but because she treated personal overhead as farm resilience. In 2022, her total living expenses were $31,860, utilities $4,120, food $5,340, fuel $3,480, insurance $7,220, clothing and boots $510, medical out-of-pocket $4,900, church and local giving $1,400, household repairs and miscellaneous $4,890. No car payment, no revolving balances, no lifestyle drift. Every avoided fixed payment protected operating flexibility. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you had one profitable year after a difficult start, would you lock in lower fixed risk, or would you scale fast because momentum feels safer than patience? Write your answer in the comments, because that fork in the road decides which names appear at auctions later. Around Callaway County and into neighboring grounds, several good operators chose the scale path for reasons that made sense on paper at the time. Equipment dealers pushed tax efficiency narratives. Lenders pushed growth narratives. Landlords pushed acreage commitments. The system rewarded visible expansion and treated caution like hesitation. Dale watched it with sympathy because she knew most of these families personally and had seen their work ethic for years. Caleb Dunn had expanded to 420 acres with a $1.1 million package tied to land improvement, machinery refresh, and carry-on leased ground. His initial blended rate was 4.6%. When resets and renewals hit, his effective cost moved toward 9.9%. Annual debt service jumped faster than his gross margin could absorb in weak pricing windows. He was not careless. He was overexposed to rate movement. By the time he listed parcels, he was making decisions in 30-day intervals instead of seasons. Maria and Thomas Weller made a different version of the same mistake. They modernized aggressively with equipment payments, totaling $14,200 per month because 2 strong years had suggested that scale and speed would offset financing drag. Then 2 thinner harvests cut working capital while repairs rose. They sold out at auction, not because they lacked discipline, but because fixed obligations arrived every month regardless of weather, basis, or timing. Jeb Ortiz carried leverage across feeder cattle, grain infrastructure, and operating exposure, counting on throughput to protect margins. When basis widened and feed costs stayed elevated, cash conversion slipped behind payment schedules. He filed bankruptcy with $2.7 million in secured debt. People in town said he had moved too fast, but that was only half the truth. He had followed the most common advice available to him in years when credit seemed cheap and expansion looked rational. Patrick Hale, who had sold acreage years earlier to cover machinery arrears, shifted into custom work and stabilized, though his family never fully recovered the land position they once held. Denise and Carl Brenner rebuilt modestly after leaving row crop expansion, running hay and contract field work with lower capital intensity and steadier sleep. None of these stories were morality plays. They were trade-offs under pressure, with rate risk and fixed payments doing what they always do when revenue variance widens. By early June 2023, that pressure broadened from individual operations into the regional credit structure. Delinquencies on agricultural notes climbed across several counties, and lenders who had priced for growth found themselves managing renewals they did not have easy room to extend. At the same time, weather turned uneven. Western stretches took moisture stress, while eastern fields dealt with timing problems and uneven stand development. Wheat prices failed to provide rescue. Input bills remained stubborn. The arithmetic tightened everywhere at once. Dale entered that season with one decisive difference. She no longer had meaningful exposure to variable rate operating debt. Her remaining balance stood at $118,000 entering 2023, and she attacked it with the same plain sequence she had used from the start. Grain marketing was staged instead of rushed. Repair costs stayed below financed replacement thresholds. Storage timing kept working. By September 2023, debt was zero. She recorded the payoff date in blue ink and did not tell anyone until tax prep required the statement. Her 2023 books closed with net farm income at $267,900 and retained cash at $611,400. Operating cost per acre, which had been $412 when she took over, settled near $301 in 2 seasons of disciplined execution. The file box that arrived heavy with lender paper now held paid note confirmations and collateral releases. She kept every document in order, not for sentiment, but because evidence matters when narratives start shifting after the fact. The wider crisis did not end when she cleared her own obligations. It intensified around her. Caleb's transition period began under leaseback terms that still left him uncertain week to week. Maria and Thomas were working long miles on a custom harvest crew model that depended on weather windows and clean machines. Jeb was in legal restructuring meetings, learning how little room secured creditors leave once momentum breaks. Even operators who had avoided foreclosure were carrying renewal anxiety into every supplier conversation. In August 2023, First Prairie tightened credit standards, reduced discretionary renewal flexibility, and began triaging relationships by collateral quality and cash flow coverage. Nolan Price, still in press shirts and still speaking in polished lender language, now spent more time explaining constraints than selling expansion. The same institution that had offered her a variable package with a cross-collateral reach was managing its own funding strain as agricultural delinquencies rose. That dynamic did not erase his earlier posture, but it changed the power map. Dale did not celebrate any of that. She had no appetite for scoreboard vindication, while neighbors were under stress. What she did have was liquidity, clean title position, and a track record that was now fully documented across 3 consecutive years. She met with her accountant, reviewed reserve tiers, and separated funds into operating, contingency, and opportunity buckets. Operating held 1 year of projected farm expense. Contingency held weather and input shock coverage. Opportunity held deployable capital for terms she could defend mathematically. One line in her September ledger captured the shift with almost no emotion. Liabilities, $0. Another line, 3 rows down, captured what came next. Cash and equivalents, $611,400. On paper, she was no longer a recovery story. She was a counterparty. By the first week of October 2023, calls that had once gone unanswered started coming in quickly, and the tone had changed from instruction to request. She answered each one the same way: send the numbers first. When spreadsheets arrived, she read covenants before cover letters, collateral descriptions before promises, and cash flow assumptions before projections. The woman in the patched coat and rusted Silverado had become the person institutions needed to persuade. She still looked exactly the same, climbing out of that 1998 truck. Under the surface sat a balance sheet strong enough to set terms in a market where terms were suddenly scarce. Counterparty became a concrete word 2 days later when First Prairie sent over a secured note proposal and asked for a meeting at 4 in the afternoon, after lobby traffic slowed and before closing, cash counts began. Dale arrived in the same faded coat, carrying a legal envelope and a calculator with tape paper. Nolan Price stood when she entered, then sat without the polished certainty he had carried in February 2021. The bank needed a private placement of $500,000 for 18 months to smooth a liquidity gap created by rising agricultural delinquencies and mismatched funding maturities. He called it a bridge. She called it risk, until proven otherwise. She asked for current delinquency ratios by loan class, unencumbered real estate available for collateral, and monthly liquidity projections under 3 stress assumptions. Nolan had numbers. Dale checked every total twice. By the following Tuesday, she had the full package and 1 additional data room password for collateral files. The branch parcel offered as security appraised at $1,340,000, with an existing first mortgage already retired and no tax liens attached. Projected cash flow from core deposits and performing loans covered monthly obligations at 1.46 times under baseline and 1.19 times under stress, thin but serviceable, if losses did not accelerate. Dale marked 3 required terms in blue ink beneath the 6.25% fixed rate: no callable prepayment during the first 12 months, monthly financial reporting delivered by the 5th business day, and a covenant requiring fixed-rate restructuring options be offered to distressed family farms before any foreclosure filing. Nolan read the 3rd term twice. He asked if it was negotiable. Dale said, "Not that line." The revelation did not happen in a ballroom or at an auction microphone. It happened in daylight under fluorescent office lights at the Callaway County Recorder window, where signatures become enforceable and opinions lose authority. On October 19, 2023, Dale signed as lender on a $500,000 secured promissory note. Nolan signed as borrower representative for First Prairie Bank. A deputy recorder checked identification, stamped the collateral filing, and slid the original back across the counter. 2 people waiting on deed copies looked up when they heard the principal amount read aloud for confirmation. One recognized Nolan. Both recognized Dale's truck parked outside with rust over both rear wheel wells. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Nolan, practical to the end, said quietly, "You were right about fixed risk." Dale nodded once, tucked the recorded copy into her envelope, and carried a note worth $500,000. Principal plus $46,875, scheduled interest. 3 days passed before the county coffee shop version of the story fully caught up to the paperwork. The details moved faster than rumor usually does because recorded documents are public, and because people who had dismissed Dale's caution now needed to understand the arithmetic that had reversed the relationship. She had not inherited a cash fortune hidden in a trust. She had built deployable capital while paying off inherited liabilities, then lent from strength with collateral and covenants. In November, grain settlements and late marketing receipts temporarily pushed gross liquidity to $913,275 before reserve allocations and year-end closes. Retained cash for 2023 would finish at $611,400. Appearance remained unchanged. She still carried lunch in wax paper. She still tracked bolts and bearings in a spiral notebook. The balance sheet, however, was now visible to anyone willing to read. That evening, she wrote a single line on the inside cover of her ledger pad and underlined it twice. Wealth sits in the terms you can refuse, not the size of the money you can borrow. Dale's first use of that leverage was not expansion acreage. It was structured rescue with accountability. In December 2023, she met Caleb Dunn at her kitchen table, same pull-chain light, same scarred oak surface, and laid out a 5-year path for 160 acres he had lost under reset pressure. Purchase price was set at $704,000, based on $4,400 per acre, with Dale taking title initially and leasing to Caleb at $140 per acre for 2 crop years while he rebuilt working capital. Beginning January 2026, lease payments converted into zero-interest principal credits if he met 2 covenants, quarterly cash flow reports, and a maximum total debt service ratio under 28% of gross farm revenue. No penalties for weather shortfalls documented by insurance records. No balloon traps. Caleb cried once, looked away, and signed with both hands steady. He told her he did not need a speech. He needed a chance that penciled out. By February 2024, Maria and Thomas Weller were running hard miles on a custom harvest plan, but lacked enough reliable equipment to stop repair downtime from consuming margin. Dale provided a $120,000 bridge loan split into 2 tranches. $80,000 for a used but field-ready combine and header trailer package, $40,000 for a support truck, tools, and preseason parts inventory. Interest was 2.0% fixed, not zero, because Dale wanted repayment discipline tied to business cash flow without predatory drag. Terms were monthly interest only in season. Principal sweeps after each contract closeout. Full amortization over 5 years with no prepayment fee. She required one unusual covenant that matched her own philosophy. They had to maintain a 90-day operating cash buffer before taking owner draws above a set baseline. By the end of their first full season under that structure, they completed 18,700 harvested acres across 3 counties, posted net operating profit of $86,300, and carried 0 delinquent vendor accounts. Jeb Ortiz needed a different framework because bankruptcy had already restructured his obligations, and trust had to be rebuilt line by line. In May 2024, after court discharge terms were finalized, Dale helped him secure 90 acres under a debt-light operating model with 2 instruments: a $52,000 zero-interest equipment note for essential tillage and planting units purchased at liquidation pricing, and a $36,000 revolving input line at 3.0% tied to documented crop plans and capped draw windows. Jeb had to file monthly retained earnings reports with Dale's accountant for 2 years. That was the price of second chance capital. It worked. His first full year retained earnings moved positive at $38,400, and he closed the year with supplier terms current and no emergency refinance requests. He called that result ordinary. In this context, ordinary was a breakthrough. By harvest 2024, Dale had formalized these efforts into a repeatable structure named the Coleman Field Fund, seeded with $1,200,000 from retained farm earnings, note income projections, and reallocated reserves that sat above her contingency thresholds. The fund issued conditional microloans ranging from $25,000 to $80,000, with fixed rates between 0 and 3.5%, depending on risk profile, and one universal requirement. Each recipient had to mentor one younger operator for at least 12 documented field days per year. Dale was explicit about the logic. Capital without skill transfer delays failure. Capital with mentorship compounds competence. Over the next 18 months, 12 operators entered the program, stabilizing 3,460 acres that had been at high risk of forced sale or distressed lease turnover. Their combined starting equity position was $2.9 million. By late 2025, verified statements placed combined equity at $6.4 million. In the first week of November 2024, Dale spread 2 files across her desk before signing annual review papers. The February 2021 refinance term sheet Nolan had once pushed, and her actual payoff record through September 2023. The refinance sheet showed a $525,000 note at 10.1% with annual resets and cross-collateral exposure, annual payments near $68,862 on a 15-year amortization, and first 3-year interest near $148,943 with only about $57,643 of principal retired, leaving roughly $467,357 still outstanding with reset risk rolling forward each renewal cycle. Her own statements, clipped beside it, documented inherited obligation and short carry interest from 2021 through payoff at about $60,650 with principal reduced to 0. She wrote the spread in red at the bottom margin. Direct interest difference above $88,000, plus avoided home acreage cross-collateral exposure. At year-end close, she reviewed the same numbers with her accountant and entered the final figures line by line into the farm ledger, not as a speech and not as a theory, but as recorded operations. 2021. Gross receipts, $428,960. Operating cost per acre, $400 to $12. Net farm income, $92,300. Ending debt, $336,000. 2022. Gross, $515,420. Operating cost per acre, $344. Net, $184,700. Ending debt, $118,000. 2023. Gross, $603,880, including basis timed sales. Operating cost per acre, $300 to $1. Net, $267,900. Debt 0 by September. Temporary November. Gross liquidity peak, $913,275. Retained cash closed at $611,400. 2024. Gross, $648,200. Net, $289,600 after lending allocations, and reserve funding. Annual living expense, $33,420. 2025, gross $671,540. Net $301,900. Annual living expense, $33,980. Personal and farm net worth marked at $4,800,000, with no consumer debt and no variable rate farm notes. The arithmetic did not reward image. It rewarded controlled risk, patient timing, and disciplined refusal. On a cold January morning in 2026, she signed the fund performance packet and attached the default report, 0 through the measured period. The 3 direct recipient cases and the 12 farm cohort showed what the structure had done in practice. $1.2 million in committed capital had contributed to $3.5 million in aggregate equity growth within 2 years, a 2.92 times expansion at the community level while regional forced sale pressure eased. Dale still drove the 1998 Silverado. The seat tier was still there. The cousins who once whispered about gas money now sent people to ask how she structured terms. Dale gave the same short answer each time. Show me your numbers first. That same week, people did exactly that. They came with folders, yield maps, overdue notices, and legal pads full of crossed-out assumptions, and Dale read each page with the same calm she had used at probate, at the bank, and at the recorder window. She did not promise rescue to everyone. She offered terms only where the arithmetic could carry the weight. By the last business day of January 2026, the first full-cycle outcome reports from her 3 earliest recipient files were stacked in date order beside the file box that had once held inherited liabilities. Caleb Dunn's file was the thickest because his path had the most moving pieces. In 2024, under the 160-acre leaseback structure, he grossed $196,800 on wheat and double-crop soybeans, ran operating expense at $100 each $28,940, and closed with $67,860 before family living and taxes. Lease payment to Dale was $22,400 at $140 per acre, paid on schedule. In 2025, yields improved and his marketing discipline tightened. Gross rose to $224,300. Operating expense was $141,120, and pre-tax margin reached $83,180. He kept debt service at 24.6% of gross revenue, below the 28% covenant. Because he met both reporting and leverage terms, January 2026 lease payments converted to 0 interest principal credits, exactly as written. Through 2027, he accumulated $68,800 in credited principal, plus an additional $41,200 in voluntary principal reduction from crop profits. By March 2028, he had completed the first purchase tranche on 80 acres, and the second tranche schedule was funded through a cash reserve account he had built to $59,400. He told Dale once, standing by a drill fill station, "I sleep now." She answered, "That is the point." Maria and Thomas Weller's trajectory moved faster than most expected, because their custom harvest model was operationally disciplined from day one. Their $120,000 bridge structure at 2.0% required seasonal interest-only payments and post-contract principal sweeps, and they treated that covenant as non-negotiable. In 2024, they covered 18,700 acres and posted net operating profit of $86,300, then applied $52,000 directly to principal. In 2025, they expanded route density instead of geography, reducing deadhead miles by 14%. Revenue hit $412,600. Net operating profit reached $112,400, and another $44,000 went to principal. In 2026, they retired the bridge early with a final wire of $25,980, then immediately moved $18,000 into a maintenance reserve account so they would not repeat the old cycle of deferred repairs. By 2027, they ran a 3-state contract window with 96% on-time completion and no delinquent vendor account. Thomas now handled logistics and parts procurement. Maria managed contracts, payroll, and cash forecasting. They hired 2 younger operators from the fund mentorship pool and paid both above county median wage with performance bonuses tied to machine care and fuel efficiency. Jeb Ortiz's progress was slower and more fragile, but it held. His post-bankruptcy plan on 90 acres used a $52,000 zero-interest equipment note and a $36,000 input revolver at 3.0% with capped draw windows. In 2024, he posted retained earnings of $38,400, exactly the number on his first positive annual report. In 2025, a late freeze clipped production. Yet he remained current because the structure had margin for a bad year. Retained earnings slipped to $21,700 but stayed positive, and supplier terms remained within 30 days. In 2026, he recovered to $47,900 retained earnings, closed the equipment note balance down to $18,600, and reduced revolver utilization to 41% of limit. He did one additional thing that did not show on balance sheets. He began mentoring a 19-year-old operator on record-keeping discipline, 1 evening per week at the cooperative office. He used to avoid ledgers. Now he taught them. The Coleman Field Fund cohort confirmed that these were not isolated wins. 12 operators entered between late 2024 and mid-2025 with loans from $25,000 to $80,000. Weighted average rate 1.9%, all fixed. Combined acreage under high-risk stress at entry, 3,460. Combined equity at entry, $2.9 million. By December 2026, verified equity across the 12 rose to $6.4 million, a gain of $3.5 million on $1.2 million committed capital. That is a 2.92 times equity expansion at the portfolio level in roughly 2 years, while default remained 0 and delinquency over 30 days remained 0. The mentorship covenant multiplied the effect further. Those 12 operators logged 196 documented mentorship field days in 2025 and 241 in 2026, training 19 younger farmers in cost coding, fixed-rate discipline, and marketing timing. The fund did not print miracles. It enforced structure. 3 days after quarter close in April 2025, First Prairie wired the final payment on Dale's secured note, $500,000, principal plus contracted interest for 18 months, totaling $46,875, minus no penalty because there was no callable prepayment allowed in the first 12 months and no early call event after. Collateral release papers were filed the same week at the recorder office, and Dale placed stamped copies in a separate folder labeled Closed Notes, right behind the inherited paid note confirmations from 2023. Physical evidence resolved, date by date, document by document. Nolan Price's resolution was quieter than people expected and more meaningful than one line of apology would have been. He stayed at First Prairie, moved from growth sales language into risk committee work, And by 2026, he was the internal advocate for fixed-rate restructuring offers before foreclosure review on qualifying family farms. The covenant Dale had required in her own banknote did not remain symbolic. It became institutional practice. In 2024 and 2025, First Prairie offered 43 fixed-rate restructure packages to distressed farm borrowers. 29 accepted, and 22 were still performing at 24 months. Foreclosure filings on owner-operated family acreage fell relative to the 2 prior years, not because markets turned easy, but because terms stopped compounding volatility. Nolan never remade himself as a storyteller. He did not need to. At a 2028 retirement dinner in Fulton, he said one sentence that people repeated because it was exact. I spent years pricing speed and learned to price survival. He retired that summer with his position intact, a revised lending template in place, and a reputation for having changed course when the evidence demanded it. By the second week of March 2028, the county had a complete roll call of outcomes, and no name was left hanging. Glenn Rourke, whose 2003 foreclosure had marked Dale for life, was living outside Mexico, Missouri, on 5 paid-off acres with a large garden and part-time repair work. He had not returned to row crop scale, but he had stability and no lender claims. Janie Kessler still held her father Earl's farmhouse and rented 62 acres on a conservative cash lease, current on taxes and repairs. Patrick Hale operated a steady custom operation with 2 combines and no long-term machinery debt, and his son had joined the business on a salary, not a guarantee. Denise and Carl Brenner continued hay and contract fieldwork, reduced acreage by choice, and reported the first debt service-free year of their rebuilt model in 2027. Caleb Dunn was back on an ownership path. Maria and Thomas Weller were profitable and hiring. Jeb Ortiz was current, mentoring, and no longer defined by court filings. The 3 cousins from probate had their own arc. They never became villains, only early judges of appearance. By 2027, one cousin had sold recreational acreage to clear personal consumer debt after rate pressure caught him. Another moved into crop insurance adjusting. The third, who had once looked at Dale's gloves and smirked, now sent 2 beginning operators to her fund intake process with complete spreadsheets and soil tests attached. The probate attorney, still practicing in Callaway County, used Dale's estate transition as a case study for young associates on why asset value without liability clarity is a half-truth. Dale herself remained visually unchanged and financially sharper each year. She still lived in the same modest farmhouse. She still wore patched work shirts in rotation. She still kept annual living expense under $34,000, with 2027 at $33,760 and 2028 projected at $33,980. The 1998 Silverado remained in service. Odometer passed 349,000, rust line unchanged, seat tear repaired once and reopened at the same seam. The 1974 John Deere 443. Oh, she had rebuilt for $3,860 in early crisis years, was still running, now over 11,200 hours, with meticulous maintenance logs and no financed replacement. Farm operations stayed debt-light, then debt-free on variable exposure, with all production notes fixed and seasonal carry matched to cash cycles. Her net worth sat at $4.8 million, built without image spending, without forced expansions, and without surrendering control of terms. Before we close this story, subscribe if you want more real cases where arithmetic beats appearances, because there are more families quietly doing this work than most people realize. Leave a comment with one specific number you track in your own life or business, whether it is debt service ratio, operating cash days, or living expense cap, and say why that number matters. Then share this with one person who looks successful from the road but feels trapped by payments they can no longer control. The final image is not dramatic, it is accurate. A rusted Silverado in a gravel lane at first light. A patched coat on a woman checking moisture, and market bids before most people finish coffee. A farmhouse with old cabinets and paid taxes. A file box that once held $482,317 in liabilities now holding released liens, paid notes, and mentorship logs from younger farmers who got a structured second chance. The poorest-looking farmer in the room was the wealthiest because she refused to confuse borrowing power with financial strength. She controlled timing. She controlled terms. She protected margin. And when security finally accumulated, she turned it outward so other families could keep land, keep dignity, and keep choosing their own futures. At first light the next Monday, Dale set the thermos on the same scarred oak table and opened the January 2029 review packets while Frost held to the porch rail. Caleb Dunn arrived first, cap in both hands, and placed 2 envelopes beside her calculator tape. One held his quarterly cash flow report. The other held a cashier check for $23,600, marked Principal Tranche 2. Dale read the report in silence, then tapped line 12 where his debt service ratio sat at 22.1%. "You stayed under covenant," she said. Caleb nodded. "I stayed under panic." That morning they drove out to the 160-acre block under a pale winter sun, and Caleb showed her tile maps he had updated with his mentee, Owen Mercer, a 21-year-old renter who had joined the Field Fund mentorship rotation. Wheat stand counts from fall seeding were written in thick pencil on waterproof paper. Cash rent assumptions were crossed out and rewritten with conservative price decks. Caleb had once made decisions in 30-day fear cycles. Now he was building 3-season plans with reserve thresholds. At noon, he transferred one more voluntary principal payment through the cooperative office terminal, $8,400, and Dale printed the receipt for both files. Physical evidence, stamped and dated, went into his binder and her fire-safe copy. By the end of that same week, Maria and Thomas Weller pulled into Dale's yard with their service truck and a folder thick with job tickets. Their bridge loan had been retired early in 2026, but they had kept sending annual statements because Dale required 5 years of post-note reporting for any recipient who wanted future fund referrals. Maria laid out the 2028 figures. Gross contract revenue, $498,200, fuel and labor discipline to plan, net operating profit $128,600, maintenance reserve account at $64,300, and no vendor account over 30 days. Thomas handed Dale a separate document and waited for her to finish reading. It was a payroll summary for 4 younger operators, including 2 former fund mentees now on full-time wages with health coverage stipends. "We can add a second support crew in 2030, Thomas said, "with cash." Dale signed their compliance page, then handed it back. "Then do it without debt drift." 3 days later, Jeb Ortiz took the chair by Dale's file cabinet and slid over his monthly retained earnings sheet, then his mentorship log. Every Tuesday evening for 9 months he had met with that same young operator from the cooperative office, teaching invoice coding, basis tracking, and how to cap revolver draws before stress made choices for you. Jeb's 2028 retained earnings closed at $55,200, up from $47,900 in 2026. With the equipment note paid in full, and revolver usage under 30% of limit at year-end. He had one late fertilizer invoice in July, resolved inside 10 days, documented with a supplier acknowledgement letter clipped to the back tab. "I used to hide from these pages," he said. Dale looked at the clean columns and answered, "Now they work for you." By March 2029, the Coleman Field Fund annual verification meeting filled the back room at the cooperative annex, not with speeches, but with ledgers, tax returns, and machine hour logs spread under fluorescent lights. 12 original operators remained current. 3 new entrants had joined in 2028 after full underwriting, bringing total active acreage supported to 4,120. Combined equity for the original 12 had risen from $2.9 million at entry to $7.1 million, a gain of $4.2 million on the original, $1.2 million committed base. Weighted default remained 0. Delinquency over 30 days remained 0. Mentorship days reached 268 in 2028 alone, with 24 younger farmers documented in field and office training cycles. Dale did not call it charity. She called it capital, with discipline attached. One major file had already closed in June 2028. Nolan Price's, and that closure happened in public, though quietly, at First Prairie's retirement reception. The community room smelled like coffee and sheet cake, and Nolan stood near a display board that tracked lending policy revisions from 2024 through 2028. The key page was not framed for nostalgia. It was framed because auditors had cited it as a structural improvement. Mandatory fixed-rate restructuring review for qualifying family farms before foreclosure escalation, cash flow stress testing under adverse price and yield scenarios, and cross-collateral limits requiring explicit borrower acknowledgement and independent review. Dale attended for 27 minutes, signed the guest book, and stood at the back while Nolan gave brief remarks. He did not perform repentance. He did something more useful. He read numbers. 43 fixed-rate restructure offers in 2024 and 2025, 29 accepted, 22 still performing at 24 months, then additional cohorts reviewed in 2026 and 2027 with improved retention outcomes. Foreclosure filings on owner-operated acreage had fallen relative to the crisis period. He looked once toward Dale and said, "The lesson was plain. Price survival first." That was his full admission, and it was enough. After he retired, Nolan moved to part-time advisory work for a regional credit training group and taught one module each quarter on variable rate exposure in volatile commodity cycles. He kept his house in Fulton, coached youth baseball in spring, and did not return to growth-at-any-cost language. The antagonist thread did not end with humiliation. It ended with institutional change and a man who altered his framework before retirement and left that revision in writing. By the second week of September 2029, Dale sat with the probate attorney who had handled the 2021 estate transfer. He was updating succession documents for 3 unrelated farm families and had asked permission to anonymize her case structure for training younger associates. She agreed with one condition: include full liability schedules, not just asset values, and include the interest rate scenarios that break weak plans. He promised both. The legal envelope from the recorder office, the one that had held her lender's side collateral filing, was scanned, certified, and archived. The original went into her fireproof cabinet beside closed note releases and mentorship compliance records. Nothing remained unresolved in loose stacks. Every paper had a home. That same autumn, the 3 cousins appeared again in a setting no one could have predicted at probate. One came to ask how to unwind personal debt without selling his remaining acreage at a discount. One brought a young tenant's numbers for fund review. The cousin who had smirked at Dale's mended gloves stood by the Silverado, looked at the reopened tear in the driver's seat, and said, "I read your intake checklist twice. We did not read enough back then." Dale did not answer with a speech. She handed him a blank template and told him to return with verified cash flow assumptions and no optimistic pricing column. The broader roll call settled into steady facts. Glenn Rourke still repaired small engines and sold produce from his 5-acre place outside Mexico, Missouri, stable and debt-free. Janie Kessler still owned her father Earl's farmhouse, maintained taxes current, and had funded a roof replacement from lease income without borrowing. Patrick Hale's custom operation ran 2 paid-for combines and 1 leased flex header under a short-term contract that matched cash seasonality. Denise and Carl Brenner remained in hay and contract fieldwork by choice, lighter scale, better sleep, and a fully paid shop edition completed in 2028. Caleb was on schedule for full repurchase completion under the zero-interest path. Maria and Thomas were expanding only from retained earnings. Jeb was mentoring and current. No named line was left open. Dale remained exactly who she had been when people misread her. She still lived in the modest farmhouse with old cabinets and repaired linoleum. Her annual living expense for 2028 closed at $33,980, and her 2029 projection sat at $34,200 because insurance premiums rose. The 1998 Chevrolet Silverado crossed 357,000 miles in October and received a rebuilt steering box for $640 instead of replacement. The 1974 John Deere 4430 passed 11,600 hours, serviced on schedule, still cheaper to maintain than financed replacement under current rate conditions. Her net worth, verified at year-end 2028, stood at $4.8 million with no consumer debt and no variable rate farm exposure. On a clear December morning in 2029, she carried the original 2021 liability tabs to the burn barrel behind the shop, read each line once, and fed them to the fire in order: operating note, machinery loans, fertilizer arrears, delinquent taxes. She kept certified payoff copies and destroyed only the working duplicates, then logged the destruction date in her records policy binder. Even that ending was procedural. The final image stayed ordinary: gravel under tires, rust on steel, steam from a thermos in cold air, a woman in patched work clothes walking from truck to shop with a ledger under one arm, stopping to check moisture, then checking terms, then checking whether the people she backed had filed their reports on time. Appearance never caught up to reality, and reality never needed it to. The farmer who looked poorest in the room kept the strongest balance sheet, refused dangerous debt structures, and converted private security into public durability: 1 fixed-rate note, 1 mentored operator, and 1 fully documented promise kept